The organized crime division. Very smart piece of business.
Oh, I thought you in particular would be upset.
Oh, I know we disagreed about you working for McClellan.
Yeah, I disagreed, Dad. At the time, I thought you were going to write me out of the will.
Yeah, but you went ahead with it because you thought it was right. And I admired you then, and I still do.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
So, you starting slow? You going after the little fish?
No, I figured Giancana, Trafficante, Marcello, go on some whales. You still there, Dad?
Yeah, I just, Those are tough guys.
Sure, I think we'll get him, though. I mean, I had Giancana on the grill in 57.
Yeah, but he walked.
Well, I know, but I got the whole weight of the Justice Department behind me now.
Carlo Gambino had the throne, but he knew it wasn't secure. The empire he inherited was under constant threat. He looked at America and saw it clearly, a land built on hypocrisy. And hypocrisy was something a man like Gambino could turn into power. He understood the way society was wired. He knew where people belonged. Racism wasn't just prejudice, it was structure. The so-called founding families, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, filled the American elite. They were the self-styled architects of the nation. What they had in common wasn't blood or land, it was faith, or at least the appearance of it. Christian Zionism tied into power, wealth, and politics. Kennedy, in 1961, called it out. Just weeks after the Bay of Pigs, he stood in front of the press and said what no president before him dared to say. Secrecy, he told the country, is repugnant in a free and open society. He wasn't talking about spies in Moscow. He was talking about the men who ran that invasion, the same men who moved between the Mafia, the CIA, Wall Street, and the White House. The titans of industry, the Vatican back channels, the Sicilian pipeline. It was all one network. Kennedy had been in office only a few months when he realized the machine was darker than anything he or Bobby had imagined during the McClellan hearings. The press was part of it too. Every story in the 50s had been written with an angle, shaping the public mind while the economy that Roosevelt built was being dismantled. Kennedy needed the press on his side, but he also warned them. He didn't want to censor them, but he was blunt. Re-examine your standards. He told them the country was under siege, even if no war had been declared. Then he hit them with the line that still echoes. America was facing a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that operated not with armies, but with bribes, blackmail, and covert power. They didn't win elections, they bought them. They didn't move armies, they moved money. Finance, shipping, oil, intelligence, politics, everything was tied together in one system, indivisible and untouchable. It was science, religion, industry, and government woven into a single machine. Mistakes were buried, dissent was crushed. No rumor printed, no secret revealed. Kennedy wasn't theorizing. He was describing exactly what Gambino and every mob boss in America already knew. Both parties were for sale. The people got to vote, but the same men owned the candidates on both sides. Guerrilla tactics by night, polished deals by day. To the mob, Kennedy's words weren't just rhetoric. They were a declaration of war. Gambino, Lansky, Lucchese, Trafficante, they all heard it. They also heard about Marcello's deportation, ordered in April 1961. That same month, Kennedy made his brother Robert the Attorney General. 2 weeks later came the speech. Within days it was clear. The Kennedys were going after organized crime with everything they had. For the Mafia, the message was simple. The president had drawn a line, and 2 years later, John Kennedy would be dead. But before that, before Dallas, before the blood on Elm Street, the man who had put some of this chain of events in motion made his own move. He went to Harlem, stood in the middle of the civil rights struggle, and paid his respects. The underworld was watching the street as much as it watched the White House. For Carlo Gambino, Fidel Castro was a paradox. On one hand, the bearded revolutionary pulled the spotlight off the mob. The headlines weren't about rackets or heroin pipelines anymore. They were about Cuba, communism, and missiles. But Castro was also a problem. He exposed America's soft underbelly, its hypocrisy, in ways that threatened the stability men like Gambino thrived on. America liked to sell itself as the world's policeman, the beacon of freedom. But Gambino and every other man in the underworld knew the reality. The same country preaching democracy was choking off its own people. Segregation, racism, voter suppression, it wasn't just aimed at poor black communities. When voting booths were shut down and access was cut, it hit poor whites too. The real fear of the American elite was simple. If poor whites and poor blacks united, they could change the entire system. Divide and conquer wasn't just policy, it was survival. And Gambino wasn't the only one who saw it. So did the Soviets, the Cubans, and every enemy America had. They knew how to twist the knife. America was becoming the very empire it claimed to despise. History proved the point. In 1932, during the Ford Hunger March, police and Ford security guards opened fire on starving auto workers. 4 men dead in the streets of Detroit. Civil rights marchers in the 50s and 60s were beaten, jailed, and sometimes killed by cops and the National Guard. In 1968, at South Carolina State College, police fired into a crowd of unarmed black students protesting segregation at a bowling alley. 3 dead, 28 wounded. America told the world it fought for freedom abroad, but at home it gave the green light for its own lawmen, and sometimes its soldiers, to fire on civilians. The Russians loved that kind of contradiction. Castro weaponized it. On September 19, 1960, Castro made his play. He stormed out of his plush Midtown hotel after a fight over money and planted himself in Harlem at the Hotel Teresa. The so-called Waldorf of Harlem wasn't luxury. It was crumbling tenements, roaches, poverty, and asthma rates that rivaled war zones. But Harlem also had fire. The streets were alive with activism, civil rights groups, black nationalists, Muslims, Christians, everyone fighting for ground, for rights, for a voice. Police brutality was constant, but so was resistance. By moving uptown, Castro did more than embarrass Washington. He exposed it. He showed the world that segregation wasn't a Southern relic. It was alive in New York City, the crown jewel of liberal America. When Fidel met Malcolm X at the Teresa, the picture was explosive. Here was the Cuban revolutionary, outlawing segregation back home, embraced in Harlem while America preached freedom and practiced apartheid. The Soviets didn't miss the opportunity either. Khrushchev came straight to Harlem. The motorcade rolled past cut-rate shops, movie theaters, and porn signs until it stopped at the Teresa. Thousands of people flooded the sidewalks. Police on horses, detectives, Cuban and Soviet security agents shoving each other. It was chaos. Khrushchev walked into Castro's shabby suite, the air stale, cigar butts on the floor, books piled on the bed. The room was a mess, but Fidel was magnetic. Khrushchev later said his face glowed. The visit lasted minutes, but the headlines lasted weeks. While Eisenhower snubbed Fidel at a Waldorf lunch, Castro ate steak with the Teresa's black employees. He made sure the cameras were rolling, and across the world, the image stuck. The US was a hypocrite. For Gambino, this was the bigger game. The Mafia had always worked hand in glove with Havana. Trafficante, Giancana, Lansky, Marcello, they had casinos, dope routes, and millions tied up in Cuba before Castro shut it down. Now the man was not only closing their business, but he was also shaking America at its core, showing the world the cracks in the empire. Gambino knew what it meant. Controlling the streets of Brooklyn or Harlem wasn't enough anymore. The civil rights movement was rising. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, the Nation of Islam, They were uniting people, building power, even controlling the rackets in their own neighborhoods. Harlem wasn't just a territory for numbers, heroin, and prostitution anymore. It was a political force. If Gambino couldn't control it, he risked losing New York itself. And while he was looking outward, to Castro, Khrushchev, the Kennedys, his enemies were moving inside his own house. Joe Bonanno, a man as old school and calculating as Gambino himself, was already positioning to challenge him for the throne. Within a year, the fight would be at his doorstep. Castro had come to Harlem to poke America in the eye. For Gambino, it was a warning. The world was changing, the streets were changing, and the old order of absolute control was slipping away. When John Kennedy won the presidency, Richard Nixon was left seething. There was nothing to do but swallow the loss, shake hands, and step aside. But in January 1961, as John took his seat in the Oval Office, the real drama began inside the Kennedy family. Robert Kennedy had been his brother's field general during the campaign, strategist, enforcer, the man who kept the operation tight. Everyone assumed he'd be rewarded. Instead, he resisted. John wanted him as Attorney General. Bobby wanted out. At Hyannis, just days after the election, the offer came. Bobby flatly refused. He worried about the criticism, the headlines about nepotism, the damage it could do to an administration still trying to establish its legitimacy. He looked for ways to escape. I have a university job in Massachusetts. Maybe even work as a foreign correspondent, anything to distance himself from Washington. But John wouldn't let go. He'd already made up his mind. For him, Bobby wasn't just a brother. He was the only man he trusted to run justice, to push through the fights that were coming. The Mafia, labor racketeering, civil rights, Vietnam, the Cold War with Khrushchev. These weren't battles for a caretaker attorney general. He needed someone ruthless, disciplined, incorruptible. The press didn't see it that way. Joseph Alsop, writing in the Gazette-Mail on New Year's Day, described how John had dragooned his younger brother into service. The whole thing, Alsop noted, reeked of family drama rather than political maneuvering. But behind the scenes, the fight was very real. At one point, John even considered moving Bobby into defense as a deputy secretary. But he kept circling back. His gut told him Bobby was the right man. The younger brother's resistance lasted right up until the final days of December. At a Palm Beach dinner, Bobby refused again. This time, for good, he thought. But the next morning, over family breakfast, John pressed once more. This time, Bobby relented. The appointment drew cries of nepotism, outrage from the political class. But those who knew the inside story saw something else. A man deeply reluctant to take power, pushed into it not by vanity or blood ties, but by his brother's insistence. Bobby Kennedy wasn't stepping into the office as a political hack. He was stepping in with reluctance, a sense of mission, and a streak of steel his enemies would soon learn to fear. For John Kennedy, it was simple. The country needed a warfighter inside justice. For Robert Kennedy, it meant putting his name and his life on the line. Within weeks, he'd be staring down the Mafia, the Teamsters, and J. Edgar Hoover. And within 3 years, the fight would cost his brother his life. When the bosses heard Robert Kennedy had been made Attorney General, the room froze. Carlo Gambino lost it. He went ballistic. This wasn't supposed to happen. Old man Joe Kennedy had promised that Bobby would be kept out of government, that he'd be sidelined. And now here he was, in the one office that could hurt them most. Even on New Year's Day, Gambino felt it in his bones. This was war. Where the first shots would land, no one knew. Marcello was still fighting deportation. Russell Bufalino was under heat. Luciano was stranded in Sicily, half exiled, half worshipped. But Gambino knew one thing. This wasn't business as usual. He turned to Tommy Lucchese. "We need to talk to Charlie." Luciano was untouchable in Sicily, but his word still carried weight. Lucchese tried to downplay it. What can he do from there? But Gambino wasn't buying it. He wasn't talking about muscle, he was talking about legitimacy. Luciano's aura, his name, was still currency. And then Gambino said the part that made everyone sit up. "He's writing a book." Lucchese froze. Gambino laid it out. If Luciano put everything he knew onto paper, deals, betrayals, alliances, the Kennedy brothers wouldn't need wiretaps. They'd just read it in print. Bobby had the Justice Department. John had the White House. With those notes, they could start connecting the dots going back decades. Genovese, rotting in prison, already hated Luciano. He blamed him for his downfall, and the rumors had been thick that Vito wanted Charlie dead. Now Vito had more reason than ever to seethe. He knew Bobby's appointment meant his chances of getting out on appeal were dead. Worse, Bobby was making him a target. Robert Kennedy understood how these men worked. Betrayal wasn't an accident, it was a business model. Jimmy Hoffa was proof. He only rose after betraying Dave Beck, feeding Robert the evidence that took Beck down. Hoffa thought he was clever, but all he did was make himself next in line for Bobby's crosshairs. Kennedy studied his enemies with cold precision. He knew Vito stewed in a cell. He knew Hoffa had built his empire on double crosses. He knew gangsters flipped when the pressure got heavy, and he was willing to apply that pressure. Others had tried Abe Reles, poisoned in custody, the parade of silenced witnesses. But Robert Kennedy was different. He wanted to break them systematically, and it wasn't just the Mafia. He had his eyes on the men who were supposed to be the watchdogs: J. Edgar Hoover, Henry Anslinger, Allen Dulles. He'd heard the whispers about Hoover's compromises, Roy Cohn, Rosensteel, the private blackmail material floating through Washington. He understood how Anslinger had built his reputation feeding on gangsters. He saw the rot. For Kennedy, the deep state wasn't theory. It was Hoover, Dulles, Anslinger, men who had become institutions themselves. Take down the heads, and the bodies would fall. That was his plan. For Gambino, it meant only one thing: wait and prepare. He told Lucchese about Luciano, about the book, about the danger of those notes getting into Bobby's hands. If Kennedy got hold of them, he could tie everything together: labor, drugs, Havana, the rackets in New York. Years of secrets, reduced to evidence. And all this before the year even found its footing. January wasn't over. The Bay of Pigs was still on the table. Originally slated for '59, pushed back after Castro caught wind, now reset for April '61. The mob was in, the CIA was in, and the Kennedys were about to gamble everything on it. The year had just begun, and the streets already knew. 1961 was going to be blood. New York was turning volatile. With Robert Kennedy sitting in the Attorney General's chair, the Commission knew the government had teeth and was willing to bite. The old rules no longer felt safe. But inside the world of Cosa Nostra, family problems couldn't be ignored just because Washington was paying attention. The Profaci family was bleeding. Joseph Profaci, the old-timer from the 30s who had built his empire on loyalty to Charles Lucky Luciano and the other pioneers, was refusing to step aside. He was sick, slowing down, but he wouldn't name a successor. He expected the same loyalty he had shown his allies, men like Luciano and Joseph Bonanno. He still carried weight, but the Gallo brothers were tearing his house apart from the inside, and everyone knew his days were numbered. Carlo Gambino watched carefully. He saw Profaci for what he was, a relic who couldn't run a modern crime family. Gambino didn't like him, but Luciano backed him, and that meant swallowing the bitter pill. Gambino thought long-term. The mob wasn't about thugs with zip guns anymore. It was about unions, real estate, and a structure that could pass as business. He wanted someone like Joseph Colombo. Clean-cut, sharp with real estate, disciplined with unions. Colombo had Gambino's soft spot, but Colombo was blocked by men like Joseph Magliocco and Profaci's own kin. Then there were the Gallos. Joey Gallo, Crazy Joe, was charismatic and lethal, unpredictable to the point of being dangerous. In today's language, you'd call him schizophrenic, but back then he was just seen as crazy. He could charm or terrify, depending on the hour. His brother Larry was more manageable, Albert, blast, more pliable. Joey was a killer with a legend. Gambino knew it and, in a way, respected it. When Gambino needed something handled, Joey usually made it disappear. But Joey never stayed on script. He was the kind of guy who could explode in a room without warning. Pete Diapoulos, known as Pete the Greek, was there through it all. He'd been Joey's friend since they were kids in Brooklyn, meeting at public school 179. He remembered Joey even then as explosive. Once, riding horses in Prospect Park, Joey's horse wouldn't move. Joey got off, walked in front of it, and punched the animal in the face. That was Joey, no patience, all fire. The Gallos made their bones young. Pete said Joey and Larry were made as soldiers for Profaci in 1957, as a reward for pulling off the Park Sheraton hit that ended Albert Anastasia's reign in a barber chair. But once in the family, the rewards never came. By 1961, the Gallos revolted. They kidnapped Profaci's brother, his brother-in-law, and underboss Joseph Magliocco. What's less known is that they also took Joe Colombo. Pete remembered. The other three were scared as hell, but Colombo held up pretty good. Larry Gallo got to like him. Profaci promised concessions, then reneged. The war was on. By the time it cooled in 1964, Colombo had risen to boss. He bought peace with the Gallos for 60 grand to put on the street at loan shark rates and a promise to make 4 of their men, including Albert. But Colombo kept them outside. He told them to stay away from hijacking, drugs, or securities, all federal headaches. His own guys were deep in it, but he didn't want the Gallos to gain prestige. The group weakened, especially after Larry Gallo died of cancer in 1968. When Joey came out of prison in April 1971, he found his brothers running on fumes. Colombo sent Nicky Bianco and Rocco Miraglia with a $1,000 envelope as a peace gesture. Joey threw it back. He demanded $100,000, expansion opportunities, and fulfillment of the old promise to make his crew. He gave Colombo 24 hours. The answer? Colombo was too busy with the Italian-American Civil Rights League. Joey exploded. He announced he'd build his own crew into the 6th family of New York. "I'll make all you guys myself," he told his men. He began bleeding Colombo's rackets, trying to pull soldiers into his orbit. Colombo, feeling the threat, tried to set Joey up at a dinner with another family. The Gallos got wind of it. They tailed Colombo, looking for an opening, but he moved heavy, 4 bodyguards deep, always changing his routes. Then came June 28, 1971, Italian Unity Day at Columbus Circle. Thousands of people, cameras rolling. Colombo at the podium, basking in the league. A black gunman named Jerome Johnson walked up and put 3 bullets in him before being gunned down himself. Colombo survived, but was left a vegetable. Everyone said Joey had set it up. Pete swore otherwise. I was as close to Joey as anybody, and he swore to me he hadn't set it up. If he had, he'd have bragged about it, just like Anastasia. Pete believed the shooter was connected to Tony Abbey Abatimarco, a Colombo soldier and big numbers man in Bedford-Stuyvesant. Abbey hated Colombo for squeezing him. hated Joey for killing his father years earlier. Pete figured Abby lined it up so Joey would take the blame. After the shooting, life for the Gallos got worse. Business dried up, everybody watched their back. Joey's relationship with Albert soured. Blast resented Joey's charisma, feared losing control. Then, April 7, 1972, Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy. Joey's 43rd birthday. He was at dinner with his wife Sina, her daughter, his sister Carmela, Pete the Greek, and a woman named Edith Russo. They'd finished the meal. Pete saw Carmine Di Biase, Sonny Pinto, walk in. He leaned to warn Joey, but before he could, Sonny shouted, and muzzle flashes lit the place. Chaos. Pete and Joey flipped the table for cover. Pete took a bullet in the thigh, dropped to the floor. He came to, staggered outside with his gun drawn, firing at shadows as a car peeled away. Inside he saw Matty the horse, Ianiello, cowering on the kitchen floor. Pete dragged him out at gunpoint, using him as a shield, only to find Joey lying flat in the street, bleeding out. Later, Joseph Luparelli, the getaway driver turned informant, named Sonny Pinto as one of the shooters. Pete said he only clearly saw Sonny, but the gunfire told him more were there. The war spiraled. The Gallos tried to strike back, even planned to hit Colombo's top men, Alphonse, Aliboy Persico, Jerry Langella, but their own crew stalled, making excuses. They botched another play at the Neapolitan noodle restaurant on the Upper East Side, hiring a drunk Vegas shooter named Robert Bongiove, Bobby Darrow, who hit 4 innocent businessmen instead of Persico and his crew. The Colombos hit back harder. They killed or wounded 7 Gallo men, while the Gallos managed none. Across the city, 16 bodies dropped in the months after Joey's murder. Most weren't even connected. When a war breaks out, everybody uses it to settle private beefs, Pete said. In peacetime, you answer to the bosses. In wartime, nobody asks questions. Negotiations were tried again. Anthony Corallo of the Lucchese family mediated. First it collapsed, then the Colombo struck, shooting up a Brooklyn synagogue's Las Vegas night, killing Steve Cirillo, wounding 4 more. With Joseph Brancato taking over as Colombo boss, talks resumed. Brancato, a Marine veteran with a reputation as the toughest man in the family, put money on the table and promised Albert Gallo his long-sought button. Pete didn't buy it. In the end, the Colombos are going to whack Blast and the others close to him. The Gallo gang's been a thorn in their side for 15 years. Pete Diapolis told it all with swagger and a chip on his shoulder. Stocky, wrestler's build, walking with the street gait of Brooklyn. He still dropped underworld slang, Babania for drugs, Gomare for girlfriend. He'd lived his whole life under an alias, his kids never knowing his real name. He'd made money in securities, gambling, labor rackets, blown it all keeping up the front. He summed it up with the cold wisdom of a man who'd been close to the action, but survived. There's a lot of money in organized crime. But in the long run, unless you're Carlo Gambino, there's no future in it. The streets were already tense. Gallo and Profaci were circling each other, and then, just weeks before the Bay of Pigs, the unthinkable happened. Robert Kennedy made his move. This wasn't going to be a courtroom war. Kennedy wasn't interested in wiretaps and endless trials. His plan was simple. Find out who didn't belong in the country, strip their papers, and throw them out. Deportation as a weapon. And the first name he grabbed turned out to be the biggest mistake of his career. When Carlo Gambino got the news, he froze. From that day forward, the most powerful man in New York never traveled without cover. He put lawyers and political fixers on retainer, tightened his rackets, locked down everything he touched. Forget expansion. The new game was survival. Dodge subpoenas, Avoid Senate committees. Stay off the deportation list. The shock that rattled every crime family in America was the deportation of Carlos Marcello. Joseph N. Gallo carried the message to Gambino. Marcello had been yanked off the street and put on a plane. Gambino couldn't believe it. He pressed for details, but Gallo only had fragments, rumors, misinformation, half-truths flying faster than the facts. One thing was clear. This administration wasn't like the others. Marcello wasn't just another boss. He had history, reach, and power that Kennedy didn't even begin to understand. His people had backed the 1959 push to invade Cuba, supplying weapons, cutting deals, even trying to bring Jimmy Hoffa into the mix with a Teamsters pension scheme to buy Castro's tractors. Marcello had ties across the Caribbean, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala. He was entrenched. What Kennedy didn't grasp was that Marcello's operation in New Orleans wasn't just another crime family. It was one of the oldest in the country, tracing back to the 1870s. By the time Gambino was boss, Marcello's outfit had a century of experience. They knew every scam Luciano ever pulled, every trick Gambino had used to climb over Anastasia, Mangano, and Scalise. They didn't have to learn. They invented the playbook. And unlike New York, New Orleans had no hesitation when it came to power. Politicians, judges, public officials, they were all fair game. These men controlled airports and aviation routes. If someone needed to vanish, planes had a way of dropping from the sky. Assassination, sabotage, it was routine. By touching Marcello, Kennedy wasn't just enforcing immigration law, he had declared war. And Gambino knew what that meant. The New Orleans family never forgot. They'd hold New York responsible for the debacle at Appalachian when the FBI raided the summit and the heat fell mostly on Genovese. Gambino had slipped through the cracks, but everyone in Cosa Nostra knew it was his vote, and Genovese's, that brought the bosses together that day. When Genovese landed in prison, suspicions flew. Most believed Luciano had orchestrated it from exile. But Luciano couldn't have done it alone. He needed men on the ground, Gambino, Costello, Lansky, and the Southern Syndicate knew it. Gambino understood that his clock was ticking. Now, war was everywhere. With Castro, with the FBI, with immigration, with communists, socialists, guerrillas across the Caribbean, the Dominican Republic, the Bahamas, Cuba, and, most dangerous of all, with the U.S. Attorney General and his brother in the White House. For Gambino, the landscape was shifting too fast. His weapons were secrecy and silence. The public didn't know the structure of Cosa Nostra, the initiations, the rules, the rituals. That ignorance was his armor. But the armor was cracking. It wasn't just one family at risk, it was all of them. Each was a potential leak. And the leaks had already begun. The FBI files tell the story. Informants were in place as early as 1958. By 1959, the cracks were spreading. The war was no longer coming, it had already started. The Bay of Pigs was never just a CIA operation. At ground level, it was a Southern Mafia job, Cuban exiles driven out by Castro, now living in Miami, New Orleans, Tampa. They were going to take their island back, recruit the young men, train them, arm them, and send them home as liberators. That was the plan. But the cracks started early. The recruits were kids, idealistic, half believing in Castro's promises of reform, torn between what he said and what he did. He was a communist, a traitor, so he had to go. But the men they were paired with, hard right mercenaries, veterans, Nazis in all but name, treated them with contempt. They called the Cubans weak, blamed them for letting Castro win in the first place. The training camps turned toxic. Racial slurs, humiliation, broken discipline. This wasn't preparation for war. It was degradation. Years later, the exiles would say the invasion was doomed before it even left the ground. One man who remembered it all was Major General G. Reed Doster, former head of the Alabama Air National Guard. At the time, he was the CIA's secret recruiter, the man in sandals and shorts, quietly pulling together pilots and mechanics in backwater towns, promising them nothing but risk and secrecy. For 21 years, he kept his mouth shut. Then, in St. Petersburg, he finally talked. Late 1960, Birmingham. The CIA came to Doster. They needed men who knew the B-26 bomber. Doster did. The same planes made up Castro's small air force, so Washington ordered the invasion force to use nothing but B-26 to make the whole thing look like a Cuban rebellion. From Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, California, Doster rounded up about 80 men, pilots, mechanics, bomb experts. He told them only this: the country needs you. It can't tell you why. It might cost you your life. They signed up. Doctors, businessmen, kids barely out of the service. They walked away from careers and families for a mission they couldn't name. The training grounds were hidden in Guatemala. That's where the Cuban exile bomber crews were drilled for the real job, flying support for a 1,500-man invasion force. CIA handlers watched. White House eyes hovered over every decision. By the spring of 1961, the men were moved to Puerto Cabezas, Nicaragua. From there, the exiled troops boarded 7 CYA-supplied ships. Doster stayed behind to manage the air crews. Their job, take out Castro's planes before they ever got off the ground. The Cubans flew well enough, considering. But just as the fight was about to break wide open, the operation was cut off at the knees. The bombers were fueled, armed, ready to go. Targets marked. 2 jets on a runway, sitting ducks. And then, orders from Washington. Stand down. The mission was cancelled. Doster had U-2 photos in his hands. He knew exactly what Castro had left, 4 planes that could tear the invasion to pieces. He could see the jets' magnetic headings, their placement on the tarmac. A clean strike would have leveled them. Instead, the planes stayed intact. A few hours later, the exiled troops hit the beaches. Castro's air force roared into the sky. His jets destroyed the supply ships, cut off the ammunition, and rolled the invasion into disaster. General Maxwell Taylor's later inquiry would admit it. This single decision, the White House's refusal to let Doster hit the planes, was the reason the invasion collapsed. The pattern repeated. Doster spotted a tank column hidden in a Cuban parade ground. He had it mapped, ready to strike. The order again, number. The tanks rolled forward. One exile, just 16 years old, threw himself under a Stalin tank with a bazooka. Point-blank suicide, a kid dying in flames just to stall the armor. In Nicaragua, Doster's instructors, his own Alabama boys, volunteered to fly combat missions. They took off in their lumbering B-26s to face Castro's jets. Doster begged to go, but was ordered to stay. He remembered Riley Schamberger in an orange flight suit climbing into his bomber. Riley never came back. 4 Americans died in those runs. One, Leo Baker, is still in a Havana morgue. On the ground, grown men sobbed on Doster's shoulder. U.S. Navy pilots stationed just offshore wept with rage because they weren't allowed to fly cover. The invasion had been strangled by its own government. Then, it was over. Doster was yanked straight to Washington for questioning. Furious, out of control, he told Bobby Kennedy and Maxwell Taylor exactly what he thought, that they'd tied the fighters' hands and sent them to slaughter. Then he went home. For 21 years, he refused to read a single article about the Bay of Pigs. He moved on: Berlin airlift, civil rights duty in Alabama, retirement. Bought a factory in Florida. But the Bay of Pigs stayed with him. At parties, when people heard he'd been involved, some turned away in disgust. Others wanted to know everything. Finally, he spoke. and when he did, the timing was deliberate. He pointed at the headlines of the early 1980s. New American covert operations brewing in Nicaragua. It sounded to him like déjà vu, like the first stage of another Bay of Pigs. In a pink suitcase, Janet Ray Weininger keeps the truth. Inside are newspaper clippings, tape-recorded interviews, neatly typed pages, bundled letters. On top, an old headline, "Daughter battles Cold War to learn truth." Her father was Pete Ray. She grew up without him, chasing his ghost across Florida, across decades of silence. The suitcase is her archive, her proof. Pete Ray had been swallowed by secrecy. In 1960, he was a reserve pilot at Fort Rucker, Alabama. In Washington, men were already drawing up plans to overthrow Fidel Castro. The State Department insisted on deception. When bombers hit Cuba, they must look like Castro's own. That meant B-26s. Almost no one in America still flew the old planes, except the Alabama Air National Guard. That was the CIA's answer. They recruited some 80 pilots and crew, flew them to Guatemala, and had them train Cuban exiles from Miami. Ray was one of them. In Alabama, only one relative knew where he'd gone. Not even his wife was told. April 17th, 1961. Playa Girón, the Bay of Pigs. The invasion unraveled fast. Washington had cut the air cover in half, afraid of exposure. Pete Ray and at least 5 other Alabama pilots knew what that meant. They volunteered anyway. Ray flew a combat mission over Cuba. He bombed a military headquarters, then made a second strafing run. His B-26 was hit. He bailed out pistol in hand and opened fire as militia closed in. He was killed on the ground. Back in Alabama, men in dark suits and Mercedes-Benzes came to the Ray home. Janet was 6 years old. They told her mother that Pete had died flying a transport plane. "You're lying," her mother shot back. "He can't fly that kind of plane." Pension checks arrived quietly from the CIA. Her mother learned not to ask questions. Janet grew up, married an Air Force pilot, and carried the suitcase. She searched Little Havana in Miami, asking strangers if they remembered Pete Ray. Cubans embraced her like family. They had all been betrayed the same way. But Americans turned away. The Bay of Pigs was an unloved memory, a fiasco of deception. Washington had committed halfway, neither obeying international law nor committing to victory. Instead, it had tried to fool the world. Men like Pete Ray paid the price. The pilots who returned stayed silent. Some trembled when she asked. Others grew bitter. "In Alabama," Janet said, "the greatest profession you can have is serving your country." And all of a sudden they went down there, and something inside of these men died. In 1977, Cubans in Miami told her their agents had seen Pete Ray's body still in a Havana morgue. Even in death, he was a pawn, kept by Castro as propaganda. Janet pushed Congress, appeared on television. Finally, in 1979, she got his remains back. By then, her husband was stationed at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa. Florida felt right. The old CIA warriors had settled here too. Men who knew the truth, but had lived quietly for years. They looked at her like a daughter. They told her stories. She taped them, typed them, and added them to the pink suitcase. The CIA finally awarded Pete Ray the Intelligence Cross in 1973, 12 years after his death. Janet didn't receive it until 1977. 2 years later, she buried him in Alabama. "I thought he'd earned the right to come home," she said. Dean Rusk sat quietly in the 80s at the University of Georgia. Outside his office, a mockingbird sings. At 73, the thunder of world power is behind him. But in 1961, as John Kennedy's new Secretary of State, Rusk helped guide the most disastrous covert operation in U.S. history, the Bay of Pigs. It began under Eisenhower. By 1959, the CIA was told, Fidel Castro had to go. Publicly, Eisenhower thundered about the Soviets 90 miles off Florida's coast. Privately, Cuban exiles vanished from Miami, funneled into training camps, first near Fort Myers, then in Guatemala. The plan was bold, reckless. Build a secret army, arm it with tanks and planes, then send it ashore to topple Castro. Kennedy inherited the plan and gave it top priority. He monitored every stage. At first it was called Operation Trinidad, named for a Cuban coastal town with the right terrain. But in cabinet meetings, objections piled up. Too obvious, officials said. It's too easy to trace back to Washington. The plan was changed again and again. Each change weakened it. The goal was no longer victory. It was deniability. The White House finally approved a swamp-ringed strip of coast with rocky beaches, Bahia de Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs. By April 1961, 7 CIA-supplied ships sailed from Nicaragua with 1,500 Cuban exiles. Their air cover was crucial. CIA-trained. B-26 pilots flying missions to destroy Castro's air force before it left the ground. Military reviewers called the airstrikes indispensable. But the strikes kept getting cut back. On April 16th, just hours before the invasion, Secretary of State Dean Rusk sat in his Washington office when 2 top CIA men, General Charles Cabell and Richard Bissell, burst in. Kennedy, on Rusk's advice, had just cancelled the last crucial bombing run. Cabell and Bissell begged him to reverse it. Without it, the invasion was doomed. Bissell remembers Rusk calling Kennedy and standing firm. No airstrike. Rusk, years later, denied the call. He said the strike was additional, not essential. Bissell, stunned, said the plan had been built around it from day one. The next morning, Castro's planes that should have been destroyed tore the invasion apart. They sank supply ships, strafed the beaches, and left the exiled troops with empty guns. The invaders fought hard. One Cuban battalion of just 350 men, led by Hernando Oliva, beat back a force 6 times their size. Civilians defected to the invaders. For a moment, Castro's hold shook, but without ammunition, without air cover, it collapsed. 95 invaders were killed, 1,700 militia dead, 1,100 exiles captured. Castro's grip on Cuba hardened into stone. To the world, it looked like a CIA debacle. But the Taylor Committee's secret inquiry told a different story. The invasion hadn't failed because the CIA ran wild. It failed because the White House strangled it with last-minute changes designed to hide American fingerprints. It was not a CIA debacle, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara testified. It was a government debacle. Even Rusk admitted years later that trying to disguise the operation had been naive. At one point, officials even suggested the exile bombers should briefly land on a Castro runway before taking off to bomb him. So the world might believe the planes were Cuban. It was theater, not strategy. The invaders paid the price. Nearly 2 years in Castro's prisons before being ransomed. Many came home bitter, disillusioned. Some went to Vietnam and died in another war of half measures. Others built businesses and political clout in Miami, shaping little Havana into a city within a city. Some drifted into drugs and smuggling. All carried scars. Grayston Lynch, one of the CIA agents on the beach, called it the Bay of Pigs syndrome. Abandonment. Betrayal. The sense that Washington, the invincible superpower, had left them to die. The riddle of who doomed the invasion still hangs. Was it Kennedy's fear of exposure? Rusk's insistence on secrecy? The obsession with making a covert war look invisible when it could never be hidden. All that is clear is this. The men on the beaches fought with courage. The men in Washington fought with caution. and Castro survived. In 1 month, the commission took losses it could barely comprehend. Gambino, Lucchese, Bufalino, Giancana, Trafficante, every boss in America was stunned. First, Carlos Marcello vanished. 2 days before the Bay of Pigs, the Attorney General had him snatched and deported. No warning, no hearing. One of the Mafia's most trusted figures, gone overnight. Then came Cuba, lost. $1 million racket, decades in the making, wiped out. The Genovese family, heavy investors since the 1930s, would take a huge hit. Havana had been the mob's golden goose, casinos, hotels, skimming, unions. Now Castro slammed the door, and the American government backed him by killing the invasion before it started. The bosses sat in shock, waiting for New Orleans to right themselves. But Marcello's family was too scattered, too unprepared. His brothers couldn't cover the empire he had built. With their leader gone, rackets slipped. New Orleans was in disarray, and the rest of the Mafia was left to fight Washington on its own. Trafficante was terrified. He'd lost Cuba, lost Batista, and was now exposed. The commission demanded answers. In Cleveland, in New York, in Chicago, the bosses gathered for a sit-down. They wanted to know, how had Castro gotten into power in the first place? The finger pointed at Trafficante. It was true. Trafficante had backed Castro, convinced he could cut his own deal. Batista had always favored Lansky, because Lansky was the man who paid him. But when Batista fled, Trafficante believed he could step into his father's old role, the undisputed king of Cuba. Instead, he bet on a man who turned the island communist and shut the mob out for good. The commission exploded. They blamed him for the catastrophe, stripped him of his seat, and cast him out. Trafficante was humiliated, furious. But he understood what exile meant. No more power on the commission floor, but no interference either. He kept his territories, his rackets, his freedom to make quiet deals. Nobody would touch him. Trafficante's exile didn't last. On paper, he'd been thrown off the commission, disgraced for backing Castro. In reality, the setback was temporary. Everything changed after November 22nd, 1963. The Kennedy assassination reset the board. When the smoke cleared in Dallas, Trafficante was no longer on the defensive. Alongside Carlos Marcello, he stood untouchable. Nobody in the underworld dared press him, because nobody knew exactly how much he and Marcello had to do with what happened that day, or how they'd done it. The uncertainty was enough. It gave them an aura of power no commission vote could erase. From that point forward, Trafficante and Marcello were never challenged again. They carried a shadow that said, "We handled Kennedy." And in the world they lived in, that made them more feared than ever. That left Lansky. The commission wanted him dead too. They said he had led them into Cuba just as Trafficante had. But Lansky was too valuable. He was the architect, the financial genius, the one man who could build new streams of income. Las Vegas was growing. The Bahamas, the Dominican Republic, Brazil, even Europe were opening up with London, Monte Carlo, and Paris. Casinos, hotels, skimming operations. Money still poured in, but the systems needed to be tighter, cleaner, harder to trace. The FBI was cracking down. The bosses turned to Lansky to rebuild the machine. He delivered. Couriers picked up skimmed cash from casinos across the hemisphere, shipped it to bosses, moved it into Swiss banks. From there, it came back to America as loans, clean money the Mafia could reinvest into new businesses. Jimmy Hoffa's Teamster pension fund financed the bricks and mortar. Lansky designed the flow. He gave the Mafia something else too. Israel. A safe haven. A place American law couldn't touch. Wealthy Jewish families, sympathetic to the cause, bought into the syndicate's businesses. They provided legitimacy, fronts, and cover. The Mafia, in turn, gave them access to Hollywood, the music industry, and casinos. Italians ran the unions and skimmed the take. Jewish financiers provided respectability and protection. It was a new model. The Italians thought short-term, cash, skim, control. The Jewish partners thought long-term, ownership, equity, generational wealth. Over time, Hollywood, the casinos and media slipped from Italian hands and consolidated under Jewish businessmen. Gambino saw it coming. He pivoted. He put his family into legitimate industries, transportation, government contracts, garment sector and charities. His children and grandchildren became fixtures in business and politics, their names cleaned their power intact. Behind the scenes, Lansky, Bufalino and others pushed the syndicate into international deals. Some even touched Israel's secret weapons program. In the 1960s, hundreds of pounds of enriched uranium disappeared from a Pennsylvania plant called New Mech. Officially, the case was unresolved. Unofficially, many investigators suspected the material was diverted to Israel's nuclear program. Russell Bufalino controlled Pennsylvania, its trucking, its ports, its logistics. His men could move anything, anywhere. Lansky was sympathetic to the Zionist cause, and his network of Jewish businessmen had deep ties in Israel. Harry Stromberg, Bufalino, Lansky, names whispered whenever the uranium mystery resurfaced. Nothing proven, nothing written down. But the suspicion never died. By 1961, the Mafia was wounded, but not dead. Cuba was gone. Marcello had been deported. The Bay of Pigs had exposed them. But they adapted. They shifted their weight into Vegas, the Bahamas, Hollywood, and beyond. And with Lansky's schemes, Bufalino's reach, Hoffa's pension money, and Israel's shadow, they built something new, part crime syndicate, part multinational empire. Everything looked different now. Lucchese sat back, staring at Gambino, and thought about Luciano. Luciano was in Sicily, whispering to writers and producers about a book, maybe even a movie. And in those whispers, he talked about two things that still rattled America: the shooting of Frank Costello and the murder of Albert Anastasia. Two shots that left holes bigger than the bodies they dropped. When Costello got hit, he had a slip of paper in his pocket with the day's casino take from Vegas. That detail changed everything. It tied Costello not just to Luciano's crowd, but to Marcello, Trafficante, the Chicago outfit, Bonanno, connections that stretched from Jersey to New Orleans. It made organized crime look real to the public, not just a headline. And Kennedy, who was already moving on the mob, wanted answers to those old questions. That made Lucchese nervous. He was old guard, one of the last from the days of Maranzano and Masseria, still standing, still respected. In New York, he was the quiet power, the one connected to Marcello in New Orleans, Rica in Chicago, Trafficante in Florida, Magadino in Buffalo, the Cleveland bosses. If he wanted, he could have been capo di tutti capi. But Lucchese didn't play that way. Low-key was his protection. And now Luciano running his mouth threatened to blow it. The commission agreed. It had to stop. Luciano's book couldn't happen. They'd even send money to Sicily if it made him back off. And Sicilians don't give money to anybody outside their blood, not willingly. That told you how serious this was. The commission called in Gambino, Bonanno, even Vito from exile. Everyone said the same thing. Shut Luciano down. There was always one man in the room eager to carry the message: Tommy Eboli. He was Genovese muscle, an attack dog who didn't sit quiet. He grilled Gambino behind closed doors, whispered about him behind his back, but to his face, he kept it respectful. His allies, Mike Miranda, Gerardo Catena, backed him. Eboli smelled angles. He was deep in Bonanno's narcotics business with Carmine Galante, and he knew the pipeline had been set up years earlier when Vito went to Italy. Bonanno tried to finesse his own deal in '57. Now the drug routes were shifting, the money was shifting, and Eboli suspected Gambino had stuck his hand in where it didn't belong. Why would Gambino move against Galante? Against Bonanno? Tommy Eboli had theories. Maybe Gambino wanted Galante weakened. Maybe he wanted Bonanno boxed in. Maybe he just wanted a bigger slice. Whatever it was, Tommy didn't like it. And that made Luciano's book dangerous. Luciano was volatile, bitter about losing his throne in America. If he lashed out, the whole commission could burn. Eboli wanted to be the one to deliver the bad news personally, because if Luciano snapped, Tommy wanted it aimed at him. Better to take the hit and get the truth out of him. There were rumors, quiet but sharp, that Gambino himself had been behind some of the betrayals. Costello, Lansky, Luciano. That Gambino had maneuvered things so men like Galante would get clipped or shipped away. Tommy's own brother Patsy had ties to Luciano and Costello. Patsy's relationships had saved Tommy once before. If the whispers were true, that Gambino had set him up but Patsy pulled him clear, then Gambino was a dead man walking. Tommy Eboli wanted to know the truth, and the only man who could tell him sat in Sicily, ready to write it all down. Luciano was trying to enjoy the scraps of life left to him. Doctors had him on strict orders: no smoking, no drinking, no late nights, and, what he hated most, no women. He kept to the shadows, quiet, but never alone. Around him were old exiles like Silver Dollar Sam Carolla, Anthony Strollo, and other deported bosses. They kept him fed with news from New York and the Commission. Nothing seemed to shake him, until Silver Dollar Sam passed on the word about Carlos Marcello. Marcello had vanished, picked up and dumped in Guatemala. Luciano froze, stunned. He demanded details, but Carolla only shrugged. He's gone. They took him, his family's scrambling. The game was changing fast. Luciano sighed, looked at the wine in his glass and muttered, "Times have shifted, my old friend." He knew his era was over. What he didn't know was that a visitor was already on his way. A man who wanted answers. Tommy Eboli. Luciano expected a courier, maybe even a friendly face like Pat Eboli. Instead, it was Tommy himself, sour expression, fresh off the plane. He hadn't come with cash or good news. He came with orders. Not from one man, but from all of them. Genovese in Atlanta, Gambino, Bonanno, even Tommy Lucchese. Lansky was in the mix too. The problem was Luciano's movie project. The bosses had already leaned on Chesterfield cigarettes to pull sponsorship from the Untouchables TV show. It wasn't working. Now, with rumors of a motion picture about Luciano himself, they weren't asking. They were telling. Eboli laid it out. The council wanted the project dead. No negotiations, no maybes. "If you don't give it up, Charlie," Tommy said, "you'll be cut off. Or worse, you won't be around to enjoy the profits." Luciano burned. "He talked to me like I was some young punk," he later told Martin Gosch. "I reminded him I saved his ass once, kept him out of Atlanta, with his dear friend Vito. But it was like talking to the wall. What stung most wasn't Eboli, it was Lansky. Why should Meyer Lansky, a Jew, give a shit about an Italian's name in some movie? Because he was pulling the strings. He had everybody dancing like puppets. He was treasurer. He held the purse. He wanted to be boss of bosses without a single fucking vote. At 64, Luciano finally understood what the genius meant. Lansky was no underboss. He was angling to run it all, Italians and Jews alike, by controlling the money. Fury gave way to calculation. Luciano yielded, told Eboli he'd drop the film. But the next day in Naples, he made two decisions that would change everything. First, he called Gosch back from London. The movie was dead, but Luciano would give him something else, his life story. Gosh would be custodian of Lucky Luciano's secrets. Second, Luciano decided retirement was over. "They don't even let me fade away like they did with Costello," he told Adriana Rizzo later. "Now they want to push me around like I'm some kid." Well, screw them. I'm going to teach them a lesson. At Rome Airport, February 26th, 1961, Luciano and Gosh struck their deal. Then Charlie laid out his new plan. "All these years they called me the king of narcotics. Bullshit. I haven't touched junk in 40 years. Once I even offered to help the US government crush the trade." They laughed. "So now I'll give them what they accused me of all along. I'm going to take over narcotics, once and for all. It's the only way I know to show my friends in America they can't order me around. Maybe it works. Maybe I get clipped. Either way, at least one man in this world will know the whole truth." The moment Tommy Eboli heard those words from Luciano, everything locked into place. "I reminded him I saved his ass once," Luciano had said. "Kept him out of Atlanta with his dear friend Vito. But it was like talking to a wall, that was it." The confirmation Tommy had suspected for months, but couldn't prove. Now, straight from Lucky's mouth, it was real. Back then, there wasn't much he could do with it. It was his word against Luciano's, and Vito still had a slim shot at beating the Fed rap. But once Tommy was back in the States, you can bet he went straight to Vito Genovese and laid it all out. That's when it all started to click. Gambino probably didn't know it. Maybe he felt it in his gut. But when Joe Colombo slid a gun across the table and laid it out, that Bonanno, Magliocco and others had greenlit a hit not just on Tommy Lucchese, but on Gambino himself, it started making sense. Tommy Eboli was deep with Bonanno. Gambino couldn't prove it, and Bonanno never said it outright. But the pieces fit. This was power chess, Mafia style. Lucchese and Gambino had already pushed out the old guard: Profaci, Anastasia, Mangano, Frank Scalise. Magliocco had inherited Profaci's seat, and Bonanno saw his opening. He'd been there since the beginning, a boss while the others were still soldiers and capos. He didn't see them as equals. He saw them as flunkies, and he saw himself as what he believed he always should have been, the boss of bosses, not Gambino, not Lucchese, and definitely not Vito. Tommy told Vito everything, every whisper, every betrayal. But Vito was locked down, boxed in behind the walls, and he knew the game. Making noise would only tighten the screws. So he told Tommy to cool it. Keep his mouth shut. Wait. None of them could have known what was coming. On the 26th of January 1962, Luciano dropped dead in Naples. With him went the last bit of balance, the old authority that kept things stitched together. And then July 1962, Valachi flipped, turned rat, started spilling everything to Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department. By the time the bosses figured it out, it was already too late. The walls were closing in. Every time Luciano tried to leave, they pulled him back. Years later, Pacino would say the line in The Godfather. But it wasn't fiction. It was Luciano's life. By 1961, Cuba was gone, the rackets were shifting, and narcotics was wide open. The Corsicans had their roots, the Sicilians had their networks, but the real power lay with the growers. Luciano had known it since Prohibition. If you control the source, you control everything. So he took the gamble. In Sicily, surrounded by exiles like Silver Dollar Sam Carolla, Luciano started building again. He funneled money from Zurich to Naples, sent operatives into France, Turkey, Egypt, Germany, locking down poppy fields, refining labs, and smugglers with small boats. He told Gosh, his ghostwriter, if they want to buy, they come to me. That's Lansky's law. Control the supply, and demand means nothing. It was risky. New York got wind and exploded. To them, Luciano was a hypocrite. He'd spent years warning them off narcotics, then turned around to take it all for himself. Suddenly, Genovese's old accusations that Lucky was the hidden king of dope looked like truth. The mail started coming. Poison pen letters, written in his broken grammar, postmarked from small towns across America. Threats, warnings, unsigned. Luciano joked with Adriana, "Let's see where the Black Hand is this week." But when Pat Eboli arrived in Naples with a couple thousand cash and a head full of messages, the laughter ended. Pat said the bosses were going crazy. When Tommy Eboli told Genovese in Atlanta that Lucky was moving on the junk supply, Vito nearly blew a vein. He demanded Luciano be hit immediately. Luciano wasn't surprised. "That little pig," he said. "He'll try something different." He figured Genovese wanted him framed. Another narcotics charge, enough to bury him for life. The stress wrecked him. Blood pressure spiked. Chest pains returned. He slouched in his penthouse, staring out the window, muttering about seeing his family again. He called for his sister Fanny to visit. He confessed to Gosh he was tired, old, maybe finished. Gosh tried to pull him in another direction, pitched him a casino project in Portugal, the Algarve coast, a hotel, a marina, a chance to launder money in the sunshine. Luciano listened, said he'd think about it. But Cinque Vitali, one of his last true confidants, saw the writing on the wall. "Charlie," he said, "drop the narcotics. It's not you. It never was. Quit now before it kills you." Luciano did. He sent word back to New York. He was done with narcotics, going back into retirement. He'd put his energy into Portugal, into Gosh's casino dream. The bosses relaxed. Money started flowing again. Enough to buy Adriana a fur coat at Christmas. Enough to keep him afloat, but never enough to silence the debts and the obligations that piled up around him. The walls were still closing in. 2 old associates, Vincent Mauro and Frankie Caruso, men once tied to Luciano, now under Genovese, got popped on narcotics charges. They made bail and vanished. Luciano knew what that meant. Now they'll blame me. He was right. The Guardia di Finanza hauled him in, interrogated him about Mauro, about Caruso, about narcotics, money flowing out of Naples. They accused him of financing their escape. Surveillance was back, wiretaps on his phones. American agents pressed Italy to move on him hard. Luciano, once the man who ran New York, who built the commission, who made the Mafia into a system, was back under suspicion, back under pressure, back in the crosshairs. His health was fading. His allies were thinning out. And in his heart, he knew what he never admitted out loud. The game had passed him by. Gambino had his back against the wall. Cuba was gone, Washington's pressure was suffocating, and Bobby Kennedy was tearing at the old commission structure with a vengeance. Then word came down. Carlos Marcello was back. He returned to New Orleans with 2 broken ribs and a face full of rage. Dumped in Guatemala, bounced across Central America, treated like cargo, Marcello slipped back into the States by undisclosed means. In June 1961, he was out on bond, ducking newsmen under an umbrella saying only, "I'm going home." At first he played it straight. Lawyers, court filings, lawsuits against the Kennedys and the Immigration Service. He thought he could beat them legally. No threats, no whispers of Dallas. Just a legal war. But by the summer, he knew better. This wasn't a courtroom fight. It was a war against an administration that wanted him gone for good. Marcello tried 3 plays. First, back channels. Sinatra carried his message to Washington. Leave the Southern bosses alone. Sinatra whispered to Joseph Kennedy, to Jack, to Johnson. Trafficante backed him, but Bobby Kennedy wasn't listening. By 62, Bobby had cut Sinatra off completely, banned him from the White House. Second, money. Marcello tried to buy immunity, spreading cash through senators, Southern politicians, segregationist power brokers. He made himself stronger in Louisiana, stronger across the South. But Washington didn't blink. Third, muscle. He turned to his network: David Ferry, Guy Bannister, the Cuban exile groups, DRE men like John Martino, Sergio Arcacha Smith. He poured in hundreds of thousands of dollars. On paper, it was to hit Castro. But Marcello knew those same men could be turned against Kennedy. By late 61, Marcello was fighting 3 legal, political, covert. He came back from Guatemala humiliated, thinking the courts could protect him. By year's end, he'd stopped looking for compromise. He started looking for payback. But Bobby Kennedy wasn't slowing down. The press didn't grasp what he was up against, so he changed tactics. After the Bay of Pigs fiasco, he helped push out CIA Director Allen Dulles and put in a family ally, John McCone, a man Kennedy trusted. Now Bobby had his own man running Langley. He studied the map. To him, the Dominican Republic looked like Cuba all over again. A gangster's paradise, run by a dictator in bed with the mob. Rafael Trujillo wasn't just another strongman. He was a friend to Marcello, Traficante, Lansky. He offered the syndicate casinos, smuggling routes, and contracts. Just like Batista. And Bobby Kennedy had seen what happened in Havana. He believed if Trujillo stayed, his country could swing into Castro's orbit. So, Bobby considered the unthinkable, not just raiding rackets, not just subpoenas, but targeting foreign leaders, dictators who had opened their doors to the mob. The message was clear. The Bay of Pigs had been a green light to organized crime, a chance for them to expand in the shadows of Cold War operations. It backfired. And now Bobby Kennedy was willing to go further, striking at the mob not just in America, but at their allies abroad. In America, the families that matter can be counted on 2 hands, maybe 100 at most. It's always been that way. Go back to Rome, an empire that stretched across Europe, Anatolia and Egypt, and the story was the same. 200 families ruled it all. They held power through 3 pillars: finance, religion, intelligence. Finance meant banking, credit, the flow of money. Religion meant belief. In Rome it was gods and temples. Today it's science and technology. Intelligence meant spies, knowing who was moving against you and moving first. Together, these 3 formed a nexus. From that nexus, everything else was controlled. Schools, the military, media, culture, government, even crime. The Mafia was just another piece on the board. Picture it like a corporation. The people are the workers, generating wealth. The middle class are the managers, what the Chinese once called scholar officials, what Marx called the petty bourgeoisie, what today's academics call the PMC, the professional managerial class. Different names for the same thing. And above them, the families, the owners. When a society rises, the dynamic is stable. The families let the managers run things. The managers tell the families to treat workers better, because better treatment means harder work, more production. This looks like democracy. The workers believe they have a voice, they make money, they feel secure, and society grows. But nothing lasts. Over time, the families produce more children. Too many mouths, too many heirs who expect a piece of the corporation. The system goes into debt. Now the managers flip. Instead of protecting the workers, they exploit them. Economists call it rent-seeking. A landlord collects rent just for owning an apartment. A lawyer collects rent because you can't step into a courtroom without him. Managers use their positions to squeeze wealth from others. They don't create, they extract. The middle class lives well. Nice houses, nice jobs, little real work. But when the corporation starts to strain, They panic. They prove their worth by driving workers harder, lying, committing fraud, exploiting the people below them. Meanwhile, conflict inside the elite intensifies. Families turn on each other. Factions form. Each side recruits managers and eventually the workers. Civil war or revolution follows. That's collapse. Outside threats don't cause the fall. They only appear because insiders open the door. Factions invite mercenaries into the struggle. And once inside, the mercenaries decide to take the prize for themselves. It's a cycle. Rise, obstruction, decline, collapse. Over and over. At the heart of it is the same instinct. The families want to pass privilege down to the next generation. That means children, lots of them, and marriages. Alliances between families to consolidate power. The middle class might limit family size, but the elite never do. Their survival depends on multiplying heirs and marrying into each other's lines. That's how dynasties expand, how they tighten their grip, and why eventually the corporation of society breaks under their weight. That's the model. It's not theory, it's history. Robert Kennedy was beginning to see it. He wasn't smarter than the game. He was in it, just like the rest of them. The families were fighting, building dynasties, carving out empires. He knew because he was part of one. The world had always been ruled by empires. Out of the wreckage of the old came the American one. Franklin Roosevelt had steered it, keeping the country out of Europe's wars until he couldn't anymore. Some said US intelligence had broken Japan's code. A new Pearl Harbor was coming, but let it happen. It gave Washington the excuse to join the war, to line up with Britain, to bury Germany. The nuclear bomb sealed the victory. Dropped on Japan, it opened a new era, the Soviets on one side, the Americans on the other. Now, the Cold War was at America's door. The mercenaries had already slipped in, Cuban exiles, communist sympathizers, Castro's men. And behind them, organized crime. Kennedy dug in. What he found stunned him. Guatemala. Controlled not by a government but by United Fruit, a company tied to New Orleans rackets and power brokers like Sam Zamuri, the Jewish millionaire who'd begun funneling money toward Israel in the 1950s. Then there was the Bay of Pigs, training camps in Guatemala, others in the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic was its own powder keg. Since 1930, it had been run by Rafael Trujillo, a brutal dictator. Castro's men hated him. In June 1959, with Cuban backing, Dominican exiles launched an invasion. A C-46 lifted off from Cuba, packed with armed men. They parachuted into the mountains at Constanza, hoping to spark an uprising like Castro had against Batista. 2 yachts followed, landing another 200 fighters at Maimon and Estero Hondo. It collapsed instantly. Trujillo's army was waiting. His intelligence network had infiltrated the plan. Within days, the invaders were dead, executed, or in prison. Trujillo, meanwhile, was no stranger to the mob. He was friendly with Marcello, Trafficante, Lansky. When Castro seized Havana, the bosses looked at the Dominican Republic as the next casino haven. Trujillo gave them cover, a place to meet, a place to plan. Kennedy saw it differently. Trujillo wasn't an ally. He was another Cuba waiting to happen. By 1961, after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, Bobby pushed the CIA to move. John McCone, the new Kennedy man at Langley, signed off. The playbook was standard: isolate the dictator, cut him off, paint him as a liability, sanctions, stories in the press. The church, once in his pocket, started to turn on him. The dissidents did the rest. Former Dominican officers, smuggling in weapons with CIA help, set up the kill. On May 30th, 1961, as Trujillo's blue Chevy rolled down a coastal road, they ambushed him. Trujillo went down in a hail of gunfire. Washington was relieved, but nervous. They'd toppled a dictator, but now the region had to be stabilized before communists filled the vacuum. At the same time, another figure reappeared. In early June 1961, Carlos Marcello came back from deportation. There were rumors Trujillo himself had quietly arranged Marcello's escape, letting him slip onto a Navy plane before the hit went down. Days after the dictator's murder, Marcello was home in New Orleans, alive, furious, and ready for war. For the mob, the timing was brutal. Millions had been poured into the Dominican Republic. Their strongest ally in the Caribbean was dead. Marcello returned to find the landscape shattered. For Gambino, the picture was now clear. This wasn't a domestic fight anymore. It wasn't just subpoenas and courtrooms. It was global. New York, New Orleans, Chicago, Vegas, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, Palermo. Governments and gangsters talking in the same rooms, running the same operations. And just like every empire before it, the insiders had opened the door to outsiders. The elite families, scrambling for position, had invited mercenaries in. The Cuban exiles trained in Guatemala and Florida, the Castro sympathizers, the far-right commandos, they were the hired guns of the Cold War. Some worked for the CIA, some for the mob, some for both. They were supposed to be weapons against Castro, but they just as easily became weapons against the Kennedys. The cycle was the same as Rome. Elites fighting elites, bringing in mercenaries to do their dirty work. And once inside, those mercenaries realized they could carve their own piece of the empire. Seeds of chaos had been planted, and the families had been the ones to plant them. Even Britain was in. Broke after the war, London opened itself to mob money. Lansky and others helped bankroll the rebuild, casinos, tourism, even Hollywood connections. The mob skimmed profits while laundering itself into high society. The royals got their cut. That was the danger Kennedy kept pointing at. The lines were blurred. High society and high mafia, intelligence officers and mob soldiers, government agents and contract killers, they were all drinking from the same glass. Robert Kennedy was beginning to understand exactly the type of people he was up against. The trouble was that the people around him still doubted him. In April '61, he'd made what looked like a win, the deportation of Carlos Marcello. For a month, he thought he'd pulled it off. Then, Marcello slipped back into the country, furious, ribs broken, filing lawsuits that turned the deportation into a public humiliation. The man Bobby had sworn to remove was now dragging the Immigration Service and the Attorney General himself into court. But Kennedy wasn't the kind of man to back down. He doubled down. As Attorney General, he made organized crime a central focus of the Justice Department. He expanded the organized crime and racketeering section. He built strike forces with prosecutors and investigators handpicked to understand mob structure, union rackets, and especially the Teamsters. He created what became known as his Get Hoffa Squad, the best lawyers and agents he could find. At the time, J. Edgar Hoover still insisted the Mafia didn't exist. He called it nothing more than gambling arrangements and race wires. He even downplayed the Appalachian Meeting of 1957. Kennedy aimed to prove him wrong. He wanted a name for it, Mafia, La Cosa Nostra, whatever it was, and he wanted it dragged into the light. By July 1962, he had Joe Valachi. Valachi's testimony humiliated Hoover, exposed the structure, and branded the word Mafia into the American imagination. Kennedy also began turning the screws on Hoover's allies. He pushed IRS investigations against Roy Cohn, Gambino's lawyer and fixer, for other syndicates. He leaned on Hoover himself. By 1962, two pillars of the old order were already out: CIA Director Alan Dulles, and narcotics chief Harry Anslinger. Kennedy studied history. He knew Luciano and Lansky had once set up Waxy Gordon by feeding the IRS tax leads, then framing him on narcotics. Kennedy flipped the strategy. He sent IRS tax bills to every mobster who had shown his face at Appalachian. One of them hit Marcello, $800,000. Adjusted for today, close to $9 million. He even mailed it to Marcello's wife, while Carlos was stranded in Guatemala, a gesture that was as much insult as tactic. Then he widened the battlefield. He used the Federal Bureau of Narcotics to hit the Corsican-Italian narcotics network. What he didn't realize was that the same old OSS and CIA networks were tied into it. Vietnamese gangs running heroin to fund their anti-communist war, Corsicans refining it in Marseille, smuggling it into Italy. The CIA covered their tracks while Kennedy tried to shut them down. He teamed with the Postal Service, targeting mob gambling and lottery operations that used the mails. Betting slips were intercepted, wires tapped. It tore up their national racing wire and cost millions in lost profits. He teamed with Customs, targeting mob smuggling routes, wiretapping them, seizing contraband. Trucks would vanish in New Jersey or New Orleans, their goods reappearing on Mulberry Street at a fraction of the price. Add it up and it was $1 billion racket, and Kennedy was tearing at it, piece by piece. He also went after corrupt local cops and politicians. Men living lavish on civil service salaries suddenly had to explain themselves. Committees, hearings, subpoenas, new laws. It was an all-out war. The mob bosses felt the ground shifting. Jewish gangsters fled to Israel. Sicilians slipped back to Italy, Brazil or Canada, gambling that voluntary exile might let them return later. Some did just that. But the ones stuck in America, Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, Colombo, Profaci, Magliocco, the Chicago outfit, Trafficante, Magaddino, the Maceo family, the Fertitta family, Bufalino, Marcello, had to stand and fight. Deportation wasn't just punishment now. It was exile without return. Kennedy even pressured the Italian and Sicilian governments to take deportees, using US financial aid and medicine as leverage. Marcello was stunned. No administration had ever gone that far. To use international aid as blackmail against a foreign government to accept mobsters, it was unheard of. But Kennedy meant it. This wasn't symbolic. It was war. The New York families, already rattled, cracked under the pressure. The Profaci-Colombo war bled through the streets until Gallo went down in December. Bonanno tried his breakaway and failed. By Kennedy's logic, if he kept the pressure on, by 65 to 67 at the latest, every major boss in America would be deported, imprisoned, or dead. The mob knew it. Gambino knew it. Lucchese knew it. Bufalino knew it. The outfit knew it. They all felt the noose tightening. Robert Kennedy wasn't stopping, and the bosses realized if he kept going, he'd finish them. What Gambino couldn't get his head around was how fast the media had turned. In the old days, the papers treated them like shadows, rumors, legends, whispers of something that might be true. Now the headlines spelled it out in black and white. Mafia. The name wasn't being buried anymore. It was being shouted. In January 1961, the Sunday Times in London ran a feature calling the Mafia one of the most dangerous forces in Sicily. It said they controlled Palermo's food supplies, irrigation water, and every farm deal in the countryside. Corleone, they wrote, was a killing ground. 154 murders in 15 years, including a goat herder shot for trying to peddle his own milk. Trade unions were special targets, the paper said. 39 union leaders murdered since the war, not one conviction. The piece went further. It laid out the history the mob didn't want public. Mussolini's fascists had once crushed them. Then came the Americans. The Allied invasion of Sicily in '43 put them right back in business. The US needed help with local networks, and the Mafia delivered. That foothold became an empire. By the 1950s, mob leaders were not just warlords in villages. They were sitting members of parliament, arm in arm with cabinet ministers, protected by the church, untouchable. The Sunday Times even cited the case of a Sicilian police commissioner who'd been brought in after the war. He hit the Mafia hard, made arrests, got confessions. But in court, the cases evaporated. Witnesses recanted. Nobody talked. 15 years later, he hadn't scored a single conviction. Then, in 1960, walking with his wife, he was shot dead. Too much knowledge, the paper concluded. And it wasn't just Europe. In New York, the American press was mocking them in a different way, using the Mafia as a punchline. On January 4, 1961, Richard Starnes of the New York World Telegram wrote a column called "Why Not Let the Mafia Run the Railroads?" His point was simple. The mob, for all its blood and rackets, at least made things work. Railroads didn't. They lost money, stranded commuters, bled the government dry. The chaps with the stilettos, he wrote, had a better record than the men running America's trains. To Gambino, this was poison. 1 week they were painted as medieval killers in Sicily, the next as efficient businessmen who could run the country better than Washington. Either way, the name Mafia was on the front page. No more shadows. No more silence. The word itself was the danger. Once the public saw it, connected it, believed it existed, the government couldn't deny it anymore. Bobby Kennedy had his opening. And for men like Gambino, Marcello, and Trafficante, it meant the old protection, the unwritten rule of silence, was gone. Gambino thought he could ride out the year. Keep quiet, keep low, let the heat pass. But he knew better. Hoover had finally opened a file, and Bobby Kennedy was drilling straight at him. The old protection, the fix with Roy Cohn, Hoover's friend and Gambino's legal shield, was slipping. On the street, the city was bleeding. Irish gangs, black crews, Italians, they were clashing over unions and scraps of power because Kennedy had ripped open the wound. Every investigation into the Italians made room for someone else to climb. Gambino saw it for what it was. The billion-dollar empire was exposed, and every hungry hustler wanted a piece. Then came the newspapers. Newsday. They were lining up with Kennedy, making their bones by naming names. Bob Greene, the reporter who first wrote about the mob's move to Long Island in 1955, came back 6 years later with a new series. This time, it was war. December 11th, 1961, the first headline dropped. Long Island, Gold Coast of the underworld. Greene laid it all out. 41 top gangsters living openly in Nassau and Suffolk counties, 15 of them on the Federal Bureau of Narcotics Worldwide watch list. 3 had been delegates at Appalachian. They weren't hiding in the shadows. They were neighbors, sipping espresso in bright waters, mowing their lawns in Wanta. And Newsday was printing their names, their addresses, their rackets. The articles ran 5 straight days, each one peeling back another layer. First the Genoveses, then the Colombos, then the Luccheses, and finally Gambino himself. The picture was bad. Greene painted Long Island as the new Bergen County, a suburb rotting from the inside, just like Jersey in the 40s and 50s. He ticked off the crimes: bookmaking, shylocking, narcotics, labor extortion, political corruption. He showed how mob money washed through banks, propped up restaurants from Brooklyn to Montauk, bought steel firms, aluminum companies, vending machine outfits. He printed stories about judges, politicians, and cops bending the rules, about cemeteries unlocked at midnight to bury mob hits, about frontmen for Genovese calling Democratic leaders daily to issue orders. It wasn't just crime, it was community rot. A top Nassau GOP man taking advice from bookmakers. A Suffolk mobster scanning his street every night before walking into his $35,000 home, knowing he had a death sentence hanging over him. 2 brothers in the policy racket shot dead in their own restaurant. A body dumped behind a bowling alley in New Hyde Park, proof the Bronx and Long Island were now one and the same. Newsday warned that Bergen County had been allowed to fester until it became one of the worst trouble spots in the United States. They were daring Nassau and Suffolk to step up before Long Island followed the same path. Nassau tried a rackets bureau, open tails, roundups. Suffolk lagged, too soft, too complacent. For Gambino, this was the nightmare. He could deal with subpoenas, even Hoover. But this? His name in the paper, tied to an address, tied to a family dinner table on Long Island. A 5-day print parade, splashing the Mafia across the suburbs for everyone to see. He wanted a quiet Christmas. Instead, he got his life and his empire printed in black ink for the world to read. Newsday doubled down. Another front-page broadside, this time on narcotics. The paper laid out in black and white what every mob boss had been trying to bury for decades. Long Island wasn't just a safe haven. It was a warehouse for dope. No mention of the OSS, no hint of the CIA's fingerprints on the old China-Indochina pipelines. None of the backroom deals that had let heroin ride into America under the cover of anti-communist strategy. The paper kept it simple. It was the Mafia. It was Gambino's world. And it was filthy. The article spelled it out. The margins in narcotics were obscene, 100 to 1 for a wholesaler big enough to control a route. And the men on Long Island weren't nickel and dimers. They were heavyweights, capable of moving product up and down the entire East Coast. Names were printed, no aliases, no shadows. Benjamin Benny Levine of Atlantic Beach, splitting time between his Long Island mansion and Miami Beach, playing too sick for trial while running a multi-million-dollar ring. John Ormento of Lido Beach, accused of dispatching heroin from a Montreal-New York pipeline worth $1 million a month. His neighbor, Andimo Papadio, under indictment on the same charges. The numbers were staggering. 15 Long Island names sat on the Federal Bureau of Narcotics list of worldwide violators, the social register of the dope-dealing elite. A federal spokesman didn't sugarcoat it. Outside of New York City, there is no place that has so many major violators residing in this country as Long Island. The paper walked readers through the shift. Before 1955, narcotics arrests in Nassau and Suffolk were penny ante, addicts, small-time hustlers. Then the mob moved in, and so did the heroin. April 55, James Fusco popped in East Meadow with 17 ounces of heroin, a .45 automatic, and a $250,000 pipeline. January 58, federal men raided Lorenzo and Ignacio Orlando in Elmont. 19 pounds of heroin, 15 ounces of opium, worth $4 million. 17-year sentences. February 1959, Mark Antonio Orlandino of Hicksville, nailed as a shipper in a New York-Chicago ring. 32 pounds of heroin seized. February 61, 2 Long Beach men plead out on a narcotics conspiracy. Franklin Square, $1,000 sales to undercover agents. The point was clear. This wasn't coincidence. Long Island wasn't just a bedroom community for retired racketeers. It had become the depot. The warehouses were hidden in plain sight, behind Cape Cod facades and manicured lawns. The paper even outed one of Gambino's closest men, Joseph Biondo, Lucky Luciano's old lieutenant. Biondo had used a fake address, 25 Daffodil Avenue, Franklin Square, to hide what reporters suspected was a narcotics stash house. The house was plush, fully furnished, with almost no electric usage. Neighbors said it was empty most of the time. To Newsday, it screamed warehouse. They passed it to the cops. Nothing was done. That was the kicker. Local law enforcement, supposedly the best in the country, looked the other way. No intelligence squad. A 2-man narcotics unit chasing junkies while the feds pulled in millions in heroin from mob pipelines. And Gambino. He sat with the paper in his hands, the date staring at him. December 12th, 1961. Kennedy had been sworn 11 months earlier, and already the mob was being dragged into the daylight. Deportation was on the table. Narcotics was in print. Every gangster on Long Island was now quaking at the thought of their name in tomorrow's edition. The gloves were off. Newsday wasn't hinting anymore. They weren't writing about underworld figures or alleged racketeers. They printed names, they printed addresses, they printed birthdays, social security numbers, convictions. For Gambino, it was stunning. In all his years, he'd never seen the press treat the Mafia like this. For decades, the papers had whispered, skirted around names, deferred to alleged associations. Now the dam had broken. The headline was brutal. Here is a rundown on big-time mobsters who have homes on Long Island. One by one, the names rolled out like a hit list. Only it wasn't the mob doing the outing. It was the press. Philip Albanese, 1108 Phillips Court, Valley Stream. Known as Phil Katz. Born November 7th, 1907. Number 3 on the Federal Bureau of Narcotics National List. Boss of Manhattan's Old Fourth Ward and the East River Piers. Arrested 6 times, convicted 3. Robbery, dope, tax. Irving Bitts, 8 Fur Drive, Kings Point. A national lottery operator. Already in federal prison for conspiring to monopolize newspaper and magazine delivery, including Newsday. Arrests, dope, homicide, robbery, policy. A friend of Vito Genovese. Benjamin Benny the Bum. DeMartino. Lincoln Drive. Rocky Point. Number 105 on the Narcotics Bureau's list. 8 arrests, 3 for homicide, never convicted. Ran jukeboxes and vending routes. Partnered with Trigger, Mike Coppola. Theodore, Teddy the Bum. DeMartino, 11 Edgewater Drive, Mastic Beach. Benny's brother. Number 108 on the narcotics list. 9 arrests, narcotics and bookmaking convictions. I lived part-time in an $18,000 brick home. Johnny Dio Guardi, 109 Freeport Avenue, Point Lookout. Serving a federal sentence for tax evasion. Twice convicted of extortion. Infamous labor racketeer. Prime target of the Senate Labor Rackets Committee. Violence followed wherever he organized. Angelo Iandosco, a.k.a. Jerry the Lug, 344 Upland Street, Westbury, number 148 on the international list. A narcotics trafficker tied to Paris and Havana. Neighbors said he died the previous summer, but Newsday listed his career as an international controller of the World Dope Syndicate. Carmine Locascio, a.k.a. Willie the Wop, 5 Shore Avenue, Bayville. Number 258 on the national list. Arrested 7 times. Bribery, homicide. Convictions, robbery, tax. Joseph Peter Locascio, 216 Audley Court, Coppiegg. Carmine's brother. 8 arrests, 3 convictions. Still running, heroin, morphine, petty larceny. Benjamin Levine, 85 Bay Boulevard, Atlantic Beach. Mansion valued at $150,000. Indicted as the mastermind of a multi-million-dollar narcotics ring. Tied to garment unions in New York. Split time with Miami. Frank Cheech Livorsi. 15 Fulton Avenue, Atlantic Beach. 15 years in federal prison on tax violations. Convicted dope dealer. Daughters married into the mob, one to Johnny Dio's brother, Joseph Magliocco, 99 Bayview Avenue, East Islip. A delegate to the 1957 Appalachian Summit. A money man hiding behind Montauk Point hotels and restaurants. One of the ruling 100 of the American underworld. Mike Miranda, formerly of 629 East Olive Street, Long Beach. An Appalachian delegate. Narcotics suspect, associate of Profaci, Luciano. Recently sold his Long Beach summer home, reportedly moved elsewhere on the island. Andimo Papadio, 121 Eva Court, Lido Beach. His backyard touched John Ormento's. Together, they were indicted for a multi-million-dollar narcotics importation case. Papadio was tied to Island Park dress firms as cover. John Ormento, 118 Audrey Drive, Lido Beach. Waiting retrial. One of the East Coast's top narcotics operators. Said to be the mob's connection for heroin storage on Long Island. Also, an Appalachian delegate. And finally, the name that put it all in perspective, Vito Genovese. Atlantic Highlands, New Jersey. Boss of bosses, in prison on narcotics charges, but still listed as an officer of County Line Steel Corporation. Page after page, the Newsday series laid it all out. These weren't rumors whispered in diners or coded talk on wiretaps. This was the front page of a Long Island paper, delivered to every home in Nassau and Suffolk. And Carlo Gambino, sitting in his Long Island home, had to take it. Every name was an address the feds could raid, every alias a roadmap for prosecutors, every rap sheet a blueprint for Kennedy's Justice Department. Christmas was still 2 weeks away, but for Gambino, the season was already ruined. Another kick in the teeth. Another reminder that Gambino's grip was already slipping. On paper, he was the new Don, the quiet man at the top. But the streets were telling a different story. The Profaci family was in free fall. Joe Profaci himself was sick and fading. His underboss, Magliocco, was lining up to take over. But everyone knew he wouldn't last. And the wild card, the one giving everyone migraines, was Joey Gallo. Gallo was a lunatic in the eyes of the old guard. He loved chaos. He loved the spotlight. He didn't mind dragging the entire Mafia into the newspapers if it meant making his point. And that winter, he was doing just that. December 12th, 1961. Brooklyn. 3 Gallo men, Larry, Big Lollipop Carner, Angelo Parfumi, and Salvatore Sally Mangiamelli, were walking out of a Court Street paint store with $65 worth of supplies. Just house paint, brushes, rollers. Broad daylight, Christmas shoppers everywhere. A dark Oldsmobile rolled up. Gunfire cracked the air, 9 shots. The shooters had all the time in the world, slow-moving car, targets wide open, but their marksmanship was garbage. They hit Big Lollipop in the ankle, missed the others entirely. One stray bullet grazed an 18-year-old kid, Anthony Buda, who had nothing to do with any of it. He walked 7 blocks bleeding before checking into the hospital. The shooters sped off. Panic broke loose. Shoppers hit the sidewalks, clutching Christmas packages, diving for cover. Big Lollipop yelled to his crew, "Beat it, I'm hit." Parfumi jumped into his car and gunned it straight to the Gallows Fortress on President Street. Police swarmed the block minutes later. They scooped up Parfumi, Mangiamelli, and eventually Anthony Tony shots Abatimarco. Everyone clammed up, of course. The cops asked questions, got nowhere. Inspector Joseph McLaughlin summed it up with a smirk. They say they don't know a thing. They're as pure as the driven snow. The only one not in the mix was Joey Gallo himself. He was sitting in city prison, awaiting sentence on an extortion rap. He missed the gunfire, missed the chaos, but it was his name, his crew, his war. For Gambino, it was a nightmare. First the Newsday exposés, now open-air gunfights with Gallows, spraying paint cans, and blood across Brooklyn sidewalks. To the press and the public, it all blended together. Long Island dons, Brooklyn psychopaths, suburban dope barons. It didn't matter who was who. To the Kennedys, it was all the Mafia. And Gambino knew. If Joey Gallo kept going at this pace, he wouldn't just take down his own crew. He'd drag all of them into the light. This was the new battlefield, Long Island. The mob didn't just bring themselves out of Brooklyn, they brought three things with them: money, conspiracy, and a system, syndicated crime. By the winter of '61, all three were on display. Take Vito Genovese, sitting in prison but still moving money. His first play was County Line Steel Corp., out of Amityville, one of the biggest structural steel outfits on the island. From there, he spread it around through frontmen, dropping cash into restaurants across Nassau and Suffolk. Each spot looked different, unconnected. In reality, they were cover operations, legitimate income streams on the surface, mob meeting halls underneath. A Huntington joint backed by Genovese and Joe Biondo had already become one of the hottest gangland meeting spots on Long Island. A Bridgehampton restaurant was bleeding $75,000 a year, but no one cared, because down the road it would be perfect for a casino. Same story on the South Shore, where Joe Magliocco and the Adonis crew were planting flags. Montauk became a revolving door for Brooklyn policy bosses and mob tourists. The cops saw what was happening. Suffolk intelligence and the state troopers were tracking rental cars with phony plates, traced back to an agency tied to Sonny Franzese. Franzese himself had just dropped $30,000 on a brand new home in Herricks. 8 arrests on his sheet: rape, arson, bookmaking, but only 1 conviction. Now he was front and center on Long Island. Restaurants weren't just about food. They were safe houses, counting rooms, and front doors for shy locking. One of Genovese's men was running loan shark money out of a Long Beach apartment. 6 for 5 interest. 10 grand borrowed meant 12 grand owed. When a Huntington bookmaker missed a payment, he nearly got beaten to death for it. And then there was Carlo Gambino. The Appalachian delegate, the so-called labor consultant, left Brooklyn for Massapequa, a cream-colored waterfront house on Club Drive, $50,000. Gambino had been there 3 months. When word spread, he was already muscling into garbage hauling contracts. A West Babylon discount store gave his people the job. When the local haulers pushed back, they blockaded the store with trucks until the manager caved and told Gambino's name straight to his face. Gambino backed down. It was one of the rare times he blinked. Robert Kennedy was already calling out men like Salvatore Sally the Sheik Musacchio as one of the nation's leading gangsters. Musacchio, Profaci's nephew, ran policy for the old boss. He set up shop in Wanta with 22 arrests and 1 conviction on his sheet. He and his crew had even tried moving a massive policy bank into a Suffolk farmer's market. The plan collapsed after a single newspaper column tipped it off. Sally had barely escaped Joey Gallo's kidnapping spree that summer when the Gallos grabbed him and 3 others to protest Profaci's vending machine racket. They were released when the death sentence was revoked, for the moment. By the time Newsday laid it all out in print, the picture was clear. 41 major mobsters living openly on Long Island. High fences, phony plates, waterfront homes, meetings in restaurants, shylocking out of apartments, contracts fixed before they were even signed. The mob wasn't just hiding out in the suburbs. They were building a second New York right under Kennedy's nose. The ghosts never stayed buried. Every old score, everybody dumped in the dark, came back to haunt the mob once the press and the Justice Department turned the lights on. Even the murder of Augie Carfano, Little Augie, a Luciano loyalist, clipped in 1959, was dragged back into headlines. Tommy Lucchese, the quiet boss who'd made his reputation by keeping low, suddenly had his name and home splashed across newspapers. Nobody was untouchable anymore. Newsday hammered the point home with a series of exposés that read like a roll call of the American Mafia, but set in one unlikely place. Long Island's Sandbar Coast, Point Lookout, Lido Beach, Long Beach, Atlantic Beach, A police source summed it up with brutal clarity. There are more major racketeers per square inch in that section of Nassau County than in any other part of the United States. They called it Mobsville, USA. 13 of the nation's biggest names were packed into seaside mansions with private piers and pastel Cadillacs in the driveways. They lived side by side, thick as thieves, and clustered together like grapes under the hot sun. Joe Sox Lanza, king of the Fulton Fish Market and master of extortion, was among them. He kept a snug home on Park Avenue in Long Beach, under his wife's maiden name, Ellen Connors. Out back, a hidden pier let him meet visiting mobsters away from police eyes. He had 9 arrests, 3 extortion convictions, and a daily ritual of picking up his mail at a lieutenant's house in Atlantic Beach. Mail that included letters from deported Vice King Lucky Luciano. Down the block were more of the old guard. Johnny Dio, Benny Levine, John Ormento, Andimo Papadio, and Joe Shep Shipani. And others just as notorious. Thomas Greco, alias Tom Palmer, an arbiter of underworld beefs with a $40,000 home on Bay Boulevard. Johnny Biello, convicted armed robber and secret Miami hotel owner, who took over as mob liaison with New York judges after Frank Costello. Joe Biondo, once Luciano's lieutenant, now settled in Atlantic Beach with Lorenzo Chappie Brescia, Luciano's old bodyguard. Their houses backed onto one another, and together they kept enforcing Lanza's will at the fish market. The deeper you drove into the peninsula, the thicker it got. On Beach Street in Long Beach, Larry Knoll lived in a castle-style Tudor mansion. He was an old Prohibition gangster who turned bookmaker, close to Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa had even lined him up with a Teamsters pension loan to buy 3 hotels in Savannah. In Lido Beach, Thomas Three-Finger Brown Lucchese enjoyed the ocean breeze from his $50,000 ranch. The boss of the Lucchese family, once the tailor from East Harlem, now played elder statesman of organized crime with a view of the Atlantic. Politics kept them safe. One of Genovese's top front men regularly called a democratic powerhouse in Nassau, issued orders, and had them carried out without question. Others had their own political insurance. When Augie Carfano was whacked and laid out in Rockville Center, the cops swarmed his funeral. Carfano's family panicked. His brother-in-law, a New York assemblyman, called in a favor from a Nassau assemblyman. The ask: open the gates of the Hempstead Cemetery at midnight, slip the body inside, hide it from police. The gates opened. When Nassau cops showed up, cemetery workers locked them out. This was the climate, Gambino, and the rest were living in by the end of 1961. Their names, their homes, their businesses, all dragged into daylight. The government was sending a message. The new year wasn't going to bring peace. It was going to bring heat. By the end of '61, Newsday closed out its series with the kill shot. The message was simple. Long Island wasn't just a place where mobsters lived. It was a place where they worked, ran rackets, and built empires in plain sight. Gambling was the engine. Bookmaking stretched from New Hyde Park to Montauk, pulling in millions every year. That cash didn't just stay on the island. It fueled narcotics, bootlegging, and smuggling operations from New York to Miami. The mob wasn't shy about it. Restaurants doubled as payoff spots. Union shop stewards carried betting slips along with dues sheets. And thanks to a Supreme Court that had clipped police wiretaps, law enforcement was nearly blind. Huntington became Ground Zero, the Suffolk command post of the underworld. 15 years earlier, wire rooms operated there with political cover. By 1961, the town was crawling with front men for Vito Genovese, now locked away but still pulling strings. Genovese. Money bought steel corporations, vending machine companies, and restaurants. His people used Jericho Turnpike as their boardroom. The man in charge was Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo, a Labour racketeer the Senate Rackets Committee knew well. Corallo lived in Flushing, but spent plenty of time in Suffolk, hiding out in Centreport or meeting his lieutenants, Phil Falco, a Manhattan policy man, and Frankie Spats Spatafora, waiting on a bookmaking trial. When the feds came looking, they'd find Corallo ducking subpoenas in rented houses, under fake names, with Cadillacs in the driveway traced to the Falco family. The Falcos were the local anchors. At 500 Washington Drive in Huntington Beach, the brick house served as a clubhouse for mob money. Officially, it belonged to Mildred Falco, wife of Eddie Coco, a syndicate gambler and Carbo ally serving time in Florida for killing a black car washer who didn't clean his car fast enough. In reality, the place was a revolving door for bookmakers, muscle, and political fixers. Cars with out-of-state plates lined the street, carrying hoods from Miami and Manhattan. Inside, money was moved, paroles plotted, and favors traded. Spatafora, Dominic, Dimmy, Fusaro, and others made the house their base. Even vending machine companies tied to them operated as mob fronts, buying up placements in bars, pushing tavern owners into debt, and turning those bars into bookmaking outposts. A Kings Park bar owner was offered $500 a week to let a bookmaker operate inside. He said no. Nobody knew how many others said yes. Corallo had muscle and drivers at his beck and call. George Atkins, alias George Roberts, chauffeured him around Suffolk. Atkins had 8 arrests, a bid in Lewisburg for interstate theft, and a summer house in Bayville. The people Ducks called friends weren't small-timers. They were names like Frank Casino, a gambling boss tied to Montauk's Star Island Casino, and James Falco, one of Manhattan's biggest policy operators, now living comfortably in Greenlawn. Not everyone on Long Island's mob map was in good standing. Vincent Gugliaro, a Gallo crew lieutenant, split time between Brooklyn and a Brightwater's home. By 61, he was marked for death by Joe Profaci. Even his relatives admitted he only showed up when he was working. Nobody said what the work was. Labor rackets brought their own cast of killers. Frank Machine Gun Campbell ran 2 waterfront locals out of Williston Park, with a record full of armed robberies and bribery attempts. Albert Acolytis, banned from the docks by the Bi-State Commission, kept summer homes in Ronkonkoma and Staten Island. Michael Mickey Bowers, arrested 11 times, made Oakdale his hideout while running one of the most violent longshore locals in the country. Benny the Bug Ross, with convictions for armed robbery and dope, was organizing Long Island security guards into his own mob-controlled union. The paper reminded readers what was at stake. 5 years earlier, Edward Merther, a Suffolk carpenters' union leader, was gunned down in his Deer Park office. His crime? Refusing to let New York hoods replace his shop stewards with bookmakers and extortionists. The series ended with a warning. "These are the hoodlums," Newsday wrote, "living and working on Long Island, carving out empires for narcotics, gambling and labor tyranny." The question wasn't whether the mob had invaded. The question was how much more blood would spill before it was stopped. Just when it looked like things couldn't get worse, the Gallo War flared again. Gambino barely flinched. He knew it was a short-term problem. Enough bodies had hit the street, enough evidence had piled up, and prosecutors had what they needed. Joey Gallo's days were numbered. The latest casualty was Salvatore De Simone, a 53-year-old hanger-on, described as a quiet living bookmaker. Quiet didn't matter. What mattered was loyalty, and he'd picked the wrong side. At 7:30 p.m., as De Simone stepped out of his President Street candy store, shots cracked the night. His son, playing cards inside, heard the pings of bullets against brick. He rushed out to see his father doubled over, clutching his side, while a black car sped off at the corner. De Simone took slugs in the abdomen and thigh. Critical condition. It was the second attack on Gallo allies that week. Days earlier, 3 Gallo soldiers had been sprayed, leaving a Brooklyn paint store. 9 rounds fired, 1 slug clipping a Gallo man in the ankle, another grazing a passerby. Before that, Larry Gallo himself had nearly been strangled with a garrote, and Joseph Magnasco, a soldier, had been shot dead on October 4th. The Gallos weren't just losing battles, they were bleeding out. Cops moved fast. Acting on a tip, they raided the Gallos' vending machine headquarters on President Street. Inside, Larry Gallo, 7 crew members, 2 shotguns, 10 rounds of ammo. Assistant DA Benjamin Schmier called it what it was, a council of war. Schmier told reporters, "It was probably a council of war we broke up tonight." Every man in the room was hit with charges of consorting with known criminals, meaning themselves. Most were already out on $10,000 bail as witnesses in the Magnasco murder case. The only one missing was Larry Big Lollipop Carner, laid up in the hospital with a sore ankle from Monday's ambush. The law was circling, and the war was eating itself alive. By November, Joey Gallo was convicted of conspiracy and extortion, shaking down a local businessman. On December 21st, 1961, the sentence came down, 7 to 14 years in state prison. For Gambino, it was one more problem solved without lifting a finger. Score 1 for the commission, score nothing for the gallows. In December, Luciano's body finally betrayed him. He collapsed with a crushing pain in his chest, rushed to the hospital as if the end had arrived. Doctors said it wasn't a coronary, just a severe attack that nearly finished him. Within a week he was back home, but the damage showed. His black hair had turned grey, his posture bent, his face carved by age. At 64, Lucky Luciano looked more like a retired clerk than the man who once ran New York. Not long after, Henry and Teresa Rubino came down from New York. Henry had always been a hanger-on, running errands for the Genovese outfit. Years back, he had pitched Luciano on narcotics. Lucky shut him down cold. But Rubino kept in touch, and by the end of 61, he and his wife were in Italy, asking to spend the holidays with Luciano and Adriana. Luciano said yes. In Taormina, on New Year's Eve, they gathered at La Giara nightclub. Luciano, Adriana, the Rubinos, old friend Chinky Vitality, and the club's owner, Francesco Schimone. Drinks, music, laughter. But beneath the noise, Adriana caught Rubino leaning on Lucky, pushing him not to retire. Luciano shook his head. He was tired. He was done. Rubino wouldn't let it go until Adriana stepped in, and Chinky told him flat, "Shut up." The next morning, Luciano confided in Chinky. Mauro and Caruso, 2 New York guys, had vanished. Everyone said they were ducking jail, but Luciano smelled Genovese behind it. He confronted Rubino, who denied everything too quickly. "It doesn't add up," Luciano muttered. After the holidays, Luciano went back to Naples. The Rubinos moved on to Rome. Then came Pat Eberly, showing up not as a courier, but as a friend. He looked grim. He told Luciano the unthinkable. The commission had decided he was a liability. As long as Lucky was alive, nobody was safe. A contract had been approved. Luciano's execution was a matter of time. But Eboli dangled one thread of hope. The council was obsessed with the motion picture about Luciano's life. If Lucky could hand over the signed script, it might buy him time, maybe even his life. The irony was brutal. For months, Luciano had sworn off the movie. But Gosh, the writer, kept pressing. Even actor Cameron Mitchell had come to see him about playing the role. Luciano had wavered, maybe even decided to go through with it. When Gosh phoned from Madrid, their conversation, monitored on both ends by police, turned heated. Luciano barked at him, "Bring the script to Naples." Gosh sent a cable with the flight details, adding the innocent phrase, bringing script. To the authorities, it looked like narcotics code. Alarms went off in Rome, Madrid, and Washington. Luciano's phone, once filled with harmless chatter, now rang with business calls, exactly what he'd always forbidden. Rubino kept pressing him, openly defying his orders. Luciano grew convinced it was all a Genovese setup, designed to frame him as the king of a narcotics conspiracy. Then came Vince Mauro. He, Caruso, and Maneri had skipped bail in New York, running wild through Europe with bags of cash, Nassau, Canada, Spain. Mauro called Luciano from Barcelona, offering loyalty, offering to work narcotics for him. Lucky slammed the phone down. It stank of entrapment. His instincts were right. Within days, the Spanish police, tipped by the FBI's Clark Anderson, arrested Mauro, Caruso, and Maneri at the Palace Hotel. They found cash, passports, and enough evidence to send them back to the States on narcotics and bail jumping charges. Meanwhile, Rome police picked up Henry and Teresa Rubino. Nothing stuck, so they walked. But in Naples, the Guardia di Finanza raided Luciano's penthouse. Adriana, hysterical, fought the cops in a sheer nightgown, screaming that they were killing a sick man. Lucky, half drugged on sleeping pills, watched in silence as they tore through his belongings. Photographs, keepsakes, Sinatra's gold cigarette case. His life laid bare. In the early hours, they hauled him off for interrogation. He denied everything. No narcotics, no business, just retirement. The calls, he swore, were about a movie script, nothing more. But the police didn't buy it. They already had warrants for Gosh and orders to seize the manuscript. Lucky Luciano, the man who built the commission, was now boxed in on all sides, by old enemies, by the law, by time itself. The final chapter had begun. Luciano had no idea what was happening back in America. He didn't know about the December exposés splashed across the papers, the open talk of deportations, the narcotics hearings, the mob hits stacking up. He didn't know that every name he had ever dropped in interviews, every hint of a book or a film, was feeding Robert Kennedy's war machine. In New York, Gambino was in a fragile position. He'd helped put Vito Genovese behind bars, but now the commission was fraying, the bosses turning on each other. In the South, Marcello and the others were panicking. "Silver dollar Sam," Carola whispered in Lucky's ear from afar, begging him to cool down, to at least show the script to the other bosses before it saw daylight. They didn't want surprises. Luciano could feel his body weakening. He didn't want innocents dragged into the crossfire, didn't want to be hit simply because the bosses back home couldn't handle the heat. He scoffed at their fear. When Dewey, Roosevelt, and the government came after him in the 30s, he took it like a man. Now these guys were terrified of deportation, terrified of losing their American empires, whining about problems Lucky had lived through in war-torn Italy. 14 years after his return, Naples looked better than it ever had, but New York's bosses were panicking like schoolboys. On January 25, 1962, Luciano, drained and pale, spent the morning at home under guard, then forced himself out to his barbershop. There, he ran into Pat Eboli. Luciano admitted he was breaking. Eboli quietly slipped him a $500 bill. By that night, the bill would vanish from Luciano's wallet during a police search. Another reminder of how closely he was being watched. Later that afternoon, Maresciallo Cesare Resta escorted him to Naples airport for the meeting with Gosh. Luciano had eaten nothing all day, taking only a glass of orange juice before leaving. At the terminal, Luciano looked frail, aged, unrecognizable to Gosh when he stepped off the plane. Gosh handed him a paper bag, Spanish brandy and chocolates for Adriana. "Maybe this will make you feel better," he said. Luciano thanked him, then pointed at Resta. This guy's a pal of mine. He doesn't speak much English. The three walked slowly through the terminal toward the parking lot. Luciano positioned Gosh between himself and Resta, then began speaking in a low, halting voice, too faint for Resta to hear. I fucked myself, Marty. They're going to kill me. Who's going to kill you? Gosh asked. All of them. I only have one friend in the world, Pat Eboli. He's a good kid. You can trust him. Please remember the promise you made me. Use it all. Don't hold back. He paused for breath, his chest heaving. I couldn't even go through with the narcotics bit. I'm not even going to end up the king of junk. Lansky's going to wind up boss of everything. They wouldn't let me out. And all the money, huh? 2 hoods, they're trying to trap me for veto. It was dead or nothing. Some choice. As they reached Luciano's Alfa Romeo in the lot, Gosh said he needed to grab his suitcase. Luciano clutched the paper bag tightly. Then he staggered against Gosh, gasping, eyes rolling back. Gosh and Resta lowered him to the pavement. Gosh ripped open Luciano's shirt and began artificial respiration, shouting for help. The clock above the terminal read 5:08 p.m. Resta fumbled for Luciano's gold pillbox, shook out nitroglycerin tablets, and placed them under his tongue. In the distance, an ambulance siren wailed closer. But by 5:26, Lucky Luciano was gone. His body jerked once, his eyes went flat, and the man who had built the American Mafia died on the pavement of Naples Airport. The ambulance arrived too late. Paramedics injected adrenaline to no effect. Gosh told Resta, "He's dead." Turning to the stunned attendants, he said flatly, "This man is Charlie Lucky Luciano." For hours, Luciano's body lay on the lot under a bilious green slicker, his blazer and flannels rumpled, tie pulled open, eyes fixed toward the night sky. When Eboli heard, he rushed to the morgue, bribing his way in. Even then, he couldn't believe it. Only when he saw the body did he cable New York. Charlie Lucky hadn't died by the gun, but of a heart attack. 3 days later, Naples buried him. The requiem mass drew 300 people, aging friends from the old days, men from the shadows, cops watching closely. A massive floral wreath carried the farewell. "So long, pal." Joe Adonis, permitted by Italian authorities, wept openly. The only family was Luciano's brother Bartolo. From Atlanta, Genovese said nothing, just smiled to himself in his cell. 8 black horses pulled the coffin through Naples to Poggio Reale's English cemetery. Bartolo quickly sold off Luciano's penthouse, farm, and whatever assets he could, leaving Adriana evicted and penniless. The estate amounted to little more than $16,000 in a single bank account. In February, the U.S. relented. Luciano's body was shipped back to New York. Reporters, narcotics agents, FBI men swarmed the casket. Lucchese sat with Gambino in silence, both men thinking the same thing. What the fuck just happened? They'd known Luciano was under strain, the endless visits, the arguments, Tommy Eboli pressing him, the weight of age, but nobody expected it to end this way. Not like this. Neither side realized how bad the other had it. Luciano didn't fully understand Robert Kennedy's war, or that Hoover, once their protector, was now sharpening his knives. For decades, Hoover had looked the other way, cozy with the mob, dismissing organized crime as a myth. But he never forgot the insults whispered behind his back, the mobsters calling him a degenerate. Now, with Kennedy demanding results, Hoover was ready to turn the bureau loose, ready to impress RFK by hunting down the very men who had mocked him. None of that mattered to Gambino in the moment. What mattered was respect. Across the country, Carlos Marcello, Tony Accardo, and Paul Rica were stunned. They'd known Luciano personally, broken bread with him. Tributes poured into his surviving family in New York and Naples. And when it came to the funeral, Gambino did what tradition demanded. Luciano had once paid for Masseria's burial, and Maranzano's funeral had been handled by Luciano. Now it was Gambino's turn. He signed off on every expense quietly but firmly, because he was now capo di tutti capi, boss of bosses, and it was his duty. On February 7th, 1962 in Queens, Gambino stood before the casket and delivered the eulogy. He spoke not as a gangster, but as a man saying goodbye to the architect of their world. A young Italian kid had come to America, barely speaking the language. He built an empire out of nothing, an empire that shaped America itself, for better or worse. Lucky Luciano had defined the underworld, and America would carry his mark forever. The bosses listened. They knew the truth. None of them, Gambino included, would ever build what Luciano had built. But his blueprint would live on. The Genovese family would remain the largest and most powerful in New York. Each boss would rule his own territory with autonomy, answerable only when the syndicate moved together on the big rackets, casinos in Vegas, major investments. They pooled money, split percentages, and kept their operations compartmentalized. No single rat could ever unravel the whole thing. The structure was designed like a crab in the ocean: lose a limb, grow another. The system was Luciano's gift. And on that cold February day, at St. John's Cemetery, as the coffin bearing the simple silver plate Salvatore Lucania was lowered into the ground, Carlo Gambino said goodbye.